Okay, everyone, welcome back. Please take your seats as we begin our second panel of the day. And it is my delight to introduce Lina Mann, the moderator of this panel, titled The People's House. Lina is a historian with the White House Historical Association, where she began as a fellow in 2017 and joined as a historian in 2020. She's interested in many different aspects of White House history, including her latest research on the enslaved individuals that built, lived, and worked in the White House. Today, she'll lead our exploration of White House restoration and collections over time, highlighting, of course, Pat Nixon's remarkable efforts and contributions to renovate and enhance the People's House. Please join me in welcoming Lina Mann and our great panelists for our second panel of the day.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today, and welcome to our People's House panel. And yes, we are going to be talking about the White House restoration, some about the decoration and collections over time, and then, of course, we are going to highlight First Lady Pat Nixon's work to restore and renovate the White House and add to its legacy. I want to go ahead and introduce our panelists this morning. First, we have Dr. Matthew Costello. He is the Chief Education Officer and Director of the David M. Rubenstein National Center for White House History and holds the Marlene Sexton Chair in White House History. Joined the association in 2016 after completing his PhD and MA at Marquette University. And his first book, The Property of the Nation, George Washington's Tomb, Mount Vernon, and the Memory of the First President, was published by the University Press of Kansas and was a finalist for the 2020 George Washington Book Prize. He also co-edited and contributed a chapter to the volume Mourning the Presidents, Loss and Legacy in American Culture, published by the University of Virginia Press. Next, I'd like to introduce, a little bit out of order, Bob Bostock. He is the consultant to the Richard Nixon Presidential Library Foundation. He has curated and authored numerous special exhibits for the Nixon Library, including the Pat Nixon Centennial Exhibit, People Were Her Project. He has also written on Mrs. Nixon's tenure as First Lady for the White House Historical Association and appeared on its History Happy Hour program discussing Mrs. Nixon's work to expand the collection. Next, in the middle here, I'd like to introduce Robert. Robert has been a journalist for 3 decades, and his work has appeared in numerous publications, including the New York Times, The Guardian, and Smithsonian Magazine, where he is a regular contributor. And he is the author of 3 critically acclaimed books, including The Hidden White House, Harry Truman, and the Reconstruction of America's Most Famous Presidents. And then finally, joining us virtually, we have Patrick Phillips-Schrock. He is an Iowa native and has been a White House scholar since viewing Jacqueline Kennedy's television tour in 1962 as an 11-year-old boy. As an educator for over 50 years, he has made a career teaching world languages, history, and theater, and was a curator for Terrace Hill, the Iowa governor's mansion, until his move to central Portugal. He is the author of The White House, an illustrated architectural history, and the Nixon White House Acquisition and Redecoration Program. It is such a delight to welcome all of these very accomplished panelists. As a historian of the White House myself, I have read each of their books and their articles, so it is very, very much my delight to be able to talk with you all today. All right. So I want to start with Bob this morning to get a little taste of Pat Nixon. We've been talking about her a bit this morning, and Barbara Franklin opened with that statement, people were her project, people are my project. Can you talk a bit about what Pat Nixon meant by this, and how does it relate to the People's House?
Thank you so much, and thank you to the Nixon Library and the Nixon Foundation. I've had the honor of appearing here last year on this panel remotely from New Jersey. When I was invited back this year, I thought, we've had the coldest winter in the East in 10 years. I'm going to come and get some California sunshine. So, and my wife texted me, it's actually nicer back in New Jersey today than it is here. And I hope she didn't say that just because I'm not there, so we'll see. But Mrs. Nixon, when she talked about people being her project, she really meant that from her heart. On her gravestone out by the birthplace, it says even when people can't speak your language, they know when you have love in your heart. And she really did have love in her heart for people everywhere. With respect to the White House, what she wanted to do was make it more accessible to people, both physically accessible and just more opportunities for people to come and see the people's house. She started the garden tours, which are still ongoing. The next one, the spring garden tour, is occurring next month at the White House, where people can go and tour the South grounds and see the Jacqueline Kennedy Garden and the Rose Garden, and usually they get to go into the house and see some of the state rooms. She developed tours for people who were visually impaired, allowing those groups to come in on special tours where they could actually touch many of the historic objects that were in the house and learn about them in that way, which is so important when someone has a visual impairment. She put in ramps for folks with in wheelchairs or had difficulty navigating stairs. A ramp at the East Wing, which is where visitors and come in to tour the house, and then one at the North Portico, so that when they were done touring the house, they could go down that ramp. She created many brochures in foreign languages, not English, to describe the White House, because so many of the visitors to the White House are from foreign countries who do not necessarily have English as their first language. She developed brochures in those languages so people could get a sense of the White House. She started during Christmas time candlelight tours of the White House in the evening, because she recognized that the folks who live in the Washington area at Christmas time or in December, not a lot of tourists in DC in December, but the people who worked in the federal government couldn't come see the White House during the day, so she started nighttime Christmas tours, candlelight Christmas tours with the Marine Band playing carols and songs, and very, very popular. And those continued for quite a few years. I think they continued up until 9/11, when the security at the White House became much tighter. So when she talked about people being her project, it was not just when she was out and about touring the country or visiting other countries, but also in the White House itself, and made it possible for more people to see the house, to appreciate aspects of the house that you don't normally see on the regular tour, and to really get a sense, as she said, she wanted people to get a sense of pride in our history and in our country, and the more people who could do that, the better it was as far as she was concerned.
Excellent. So I wanted to open with that little bit about Pat Nixon, because now we have to go back and take us through a little journey through time in order to get up to Pat Nixon. So I first want to briefly start with the 19th century. Matt, I was wondering if you could discuss the 19th century White House and any structural changes that may have happened during the 19th century. Big question.
Yes, I'll try to be as concise as possible with this. But we're going to hear about some of the later restoration and renovations. But the White House was always sort of a perpetual work in progress. And oftentimes when presidents or first ladies or first families came to the White House, we hear these accounts of what the building looked like. They were generally not positive assessments in terms of the furnishings, in terms of the decor. And a big part of that was the Congress appropriated only so much money per administration for furniture and furnishings. And it wasn't a particularly large amount. And so presidents and first ladies oftentimes had to bring personal items with them to help fill out this massive space. Or they would auction off historic furnishings at a local auction house in Washington, D.C., take those funds and purchase new things. This is a big part of why the White House collection today, you'll hear stories of things being returned to the White House, returning to the collection, and that's because that's really how these artifacts and objects passed through the White House for about 150 years or so, 160 years. And so what we have is a 19th century house that is burned in the War of 1812. It is rebuilt very quickly by James Hoban and his crew, but in order to maximize the efficiency of that and getting the building open, they do make some changes in terms of the interior structure and support. Hoban opts to use more wood and more wood beams throughout for the interiors. And eventually, as more and more renovations are done throughout the 19th century, additional weight is placed on that interior system. And so you get the 1902 Theodore Roosevelt renovation, which adds these massive steel trusses to the upper floors. And then really, I think probably the big thing that really does it in is Calvin Coolidge adds another level and a new roof, again with more modern building materials. We're talking about steel, we're talking about concrete, and all this additional weight is being added on top of the White House, which is primarily stone, brick, and wood. And because the foundational support wasn't there for this additional weight, what you get over time is the White House is sort of slowly collapsing. And what I mean by that is there are these instances of things happening in the White House and they can't really explain what is going on. There are these noises that they hear. Everybody assumes the White House is haunted. I've often thought that this was probably the building literally groaning from some of the weight. And sometimes even sort of the popping of noises in the walls was probably some of those wood interior pieces actually shattering and splitting. And so who's to say there could still be ghosts at the White House. But I do think a big part of it was trying to update the building with more modern materials and just sort of layering that on top of really a 19th century home. And ultimately that's going to lead to the major Truman renovation between 1948 and 1952.
Excellent segue. Robert, when Harry Truman and his family move into the White House, they find some structural difficulties. Can you talk about that and the renovation that follows?
Of course. Well, first of all, when the Trumans moved into the house, Assistant Usher J.B. West referred to it as a rundown Chautauqua hotel. Margaret Truman referred to it as an abandoned hotel. And in fact, it did look like that, mostly because the Roosevelts had been in residence for so long. And as just mentioned, when Eleanor left, she took a lot of the furniture with her because a lot of it had come down from Hyde Park in the first place. The Roosevelts had not spent a great deal of money on the upkeep of the house, especially during the war. They were budget conscious, so they didn't paint inside or outside, which led to the joke that it's actually called the off-white house. So the first thing that they did was slap some paint on the walls, and they made do with what leftover furniture they could find. They cobbled it together. The Trumans moved from their Connecticut Avenue apartment with no furniture. The only thing they brought with them was Margaret Truman's piano. So they thought that painting would be enough, but of course it wasn't. And I'll pick up on the ghost thing. Harry Truman mentioned the ghost in his letters to Bess as he worked alone in his office on the second floor. And he says, "I hear the ghosts, and the ghosts are making the curtains sway." Well, maybe, but in fact, it was the house pulling itself apart. And when they had started with the interior work, when the Trumans first came in, one of the things they found were big cracks running through the wall. And at first the assumption was that those were aesthetic, that was just the plaster cracking. In fact, it was not. And so as they stayed there, it was almost as though the house took its cue and began falling apart on its own. And it was a series of events that led to their awareness of it. One of them that's worth mentioning took place in the East Room. So I want you to use your imagination. There's a grand piano down there, and you can just pick one of these chandeliers. It was in late 1947, Harry Truman had his favorite pianist, Eugene Liszt, playing, and Liszt was set up under one of the chandeliers, and Harry Truman looked up, and the chandelier was going like this. So swinging chandeliers were a harbinger of what was to come. And again, as mentioned, all of the improvements that had been made to the house during the industrial period, you're talking about lead pipe, conduits of every kind, which didn't only add weight. To get these things through, electrical lines, gas lines, they would open up the floor of the wall and cut a hole in the beam or the joist and just patch it up, right? And they figured, well, it's just this one time, no big deal. But if every presidential administration orders these improvements over time, what you get is a Swiss cheese effect. And I don't want to run over time, but I'll just say briefly, the house that James Hoban had designed was entirely suitable for a gentleman of 1800. He did not reckon with the weight that would be added later. So it was a load-bearing structure, and the exterior walls were very thick, and they were on very solid footings. That wasn't the problem. The problem was in the center of the house, where a lot of that load came bearing down. And when the inspection was finally done properly in 1948, which told them just in how much trouble they were in, they discovered that the footings of a lot of those walls, it was just rubble work. sitting on sandy ground. And at that time, they estimated that there were 20 tons per linear foot pushing down, yes, on sand. And so you had a house collapsing from within.
Excellent. Well, not excellent. That's actually not excellent at all. Terrible.
I thought it was excellent.
Well, I'm sure, yeah. All right, so we've heard about these architectural changes throughout the years, but I wanted to turn to Patrick and see if the Nixons oversee any structural changes to the White House.
Okay, Bostock, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. In the house itself, it's about less than 20 years old interior-wise because of the changes made by President Truman. So in the residence itself, the designers, Edward Vason Jones and Clement Conger, concentrated on plasterwork. They wanted to improve the plasterwork that had been installed in 1952 and from 1902 as well to make it more 19th century, the same period as the White House was built. So in the green room and the blue room, there were changes to like the plaster cornices and the ceiling medallions as well. So as far as structurally in the White House itself, the residence, there was very little that they could do. I should mention the plaster worker named Adolphe Blaylock from Georgia. He was an excellent craftsman. And sometimes the designer himself, Edward Vason Jones, would climb the scaffolds and help out himself. He didn't mind getting his hands wet with plaster to help out as much as he could. If you talk about structural changes, major changes came about in the Latrobe-Hoban west wing, the long terrace that was used for stables and servants' quarters for much of the 19th and early 20th centuries. There, President Nixon decided that he would like to get the press itself out of the West Wing. And he looked around at various options, including building a structure between the White House and the OEB, which was canceled. They said no. So he finally landed upon the swimming pool, which he didn't use. It had dated from the time of FDR, and decided to cover that over and create a new press facility. And that was what was done. They did very extensive archaeological work at the time to document what was there. It's very good reading. There are several articles in White House history magazines that can go into that. So that was a major change there. On the West Wing itself, there was the porte cochere added. Am I too French? Porte cochere. It's a covered porch to the front of the building, so that when the president or anyone drove up, they would be covered from the elements. That was the major change. He added 4 Tuscan order bottle-shaped columns to the front of the West Wing, which is still there. And that's about all the major changes that occurred structurally.
Excellent. So now that we've got a bit of a background on the structure of the White House and how it changed over the years, I want to turn to the interiors, more of the decor, and some of the restorations that happened. First, I want to start with Robert. After the house is structurally stabilized and sort of put back together, how do the Trumans go around decorating the White House? What remains from before the restoration, and what is Bess Truman's involvement?
Well, they didn't have a lot to work with because the appropriation for the renovation itself, and I should say this was a complete rebuilding, they gutted the house. They kept only the exterior walls, which incidentally Bess Truman was very much in favor of and probably had some influence on Harry Truman in advocating. But they built a freestanding structure within the White House, steel beams, and then it was tied in to the walls. So that cost a lot of money. And the appropriation that they got for all of that work, including digging 2 new levels below ground, was $5.2 million. So let's adjust for inflation. That comes to about 72 million or so today. That will buy 1 Osprey aircraft. And just a point of reference, the French just got finished rebuilding Notre Dame. That cost 800 million. So in fact, Congress was quite stingy with the money. The money went for the structural work. There was enough left for the interiors, but that was plasterwork, parquet, this sort of thing. By the time all that was done, there was very, very little left for the family to work with in terms of furnishings. What had happened was the furnishings that had been left after the Roosevelts had all been trucked over to a storage wing at the National Gallery of Art. And we're talking about reproduction pieces. There was very, very little here of true historical merit. And so they went over there and picked out what looked less bad than other things. And they trucked that up to B. Altman and Company in New York, which had the contract for the interior work. B. Altman restained the wood and fixed up the wobbly legs, did some reupholstery, and all that came back down. So Bess Truman, although I want to give her props for this, she said, I don't want to do too much interior work because we're only going to be here for a year. They were in residence, the Trumans, by the time the renovation was finished, the Trumans had less than a year to live in the White House before the Eisenhowers came in. And so Beth, to her credit, said, I don't want to do too much, right? The fact is she couldn't afford to do very much because there wasn't much money left. So what she did was pick out colors, curtains, draperies. She really liked bombastic floral prints, and you see quite a fair amount of that. And then the furniture was a mixture of what had been repurposed and restored. The new things that were purchased were reproduction pieces. If you were to go into Ethan Allen and, ask them for their federal stuff, this is kind of what we're talking about. This is why many visitors to the White House after the Truman renovation said, including Eleanor Roosevelt, she said it looks exactly like a room at the Sheraton, and it did. But what's interesting about the interior work relative to Bess is the spin on the press release that came out right before the interiors were revealed. And I don't know who the PR person is who did this, but hats off. They called it an American interpretation of the Georgian epic. Well, last I checked, Thomas Jefferson didn't have a lazy chair and a Bridgewater sofa. So this was like, vaguely federal, but it was also very much suburban. And when you see the watercolor renderings of it, you see pastels that remind you of the toasters and refrigerators that were coming out around the same time, light blues and purple, well, very light lavenders, say. So Bess actually did have an influence in terms of the fabrics and the colors, but to her credit, she didn't take too heavy a hand because she understood that as soon as maybe Eisenhower got in, she might have some changes in mind, and in fact, she did.
Excellent. So if Bess Truman has more of a restrained approach to the White House, this brings us to Jacqueline Kennedy. Matt, I was wondering, can you talk a little bit about her redecoration of the White House and who she works with, and what impact does she have on the collection overall?
Sure. So, and it's interesting because I think we toss around these words, redecoration, renovation, restoration. Mrs. Kennedy would have probably used the word restoration. And when she talked about it, that was really how she was talking about this project to the American people, that the White House should reflect the history of the United States. And that includes the incredible cabinet makers, craftsmen, people who created these pieces that probably never actually were in the White House, but instead the White House should be a stage for those historic examples. And as part of this project, Mrs. Kennedy, she began sort of with a typical Congressional Appropriations Fund for redecorating. I think in her time it was only $50,000, which didn't go very far in 1961. And she worked with Dorothy Sister Parrish to do a lot of the redecorating on the second floor. She expends that money pretty quickly. She hasn't even really touched the state floor. So obviously this is a problem for Mrs. Kennedy. And in part what she does is she creates a fine arts committee for the White House. She works very closely with Henry Francis DuPont, who founded the Winter Term program. And then also she has quite a few allies, friends, acquaintances who are also very much involved with, acquiring American antiques and historic pieces. And so all these things sort of converge together right around the same time that Congress passes a law designating the White House as a museum, and that it should preserve the museum character and that those furnishings that are in the White House are considered property of the United States. And so you have all of these things sort of happening all at the same time when the Kennedys are in the White House. And so Mrs. Kennedy really seizes this opportunity to remake, restore the White House to be more of this museum interpretation of American craftsmanship. And so she works with H.F. DuPont, she works with Dorothy Parrish, she works with Stéphane Boudon, who was the primary designer, and then a mix of other voices are in there, giving Mrs. Kennedy counsel. And then she also hires the first White House curator, a woman named Lorraine Waxman Pierce, who is assisting and trying to balance all the different demands that Mrs. Kennedy really has. And so, as an add-on to all of that work that she does, the other big part that she does is she really makes it more of a PR, a public relations thing. She hosts a very famous tour of the White House after some of the restoration work is done, and it airs on Valentine's Day, 1962. More than 50 million people will see the broadcast. I know Patrick, I think, was one of the, I think he alluded to that earlier. He was one of the viewers right there. And, but I'll point out that there was a televised White House tour prior to Mrs. Kennedy, and that was President Truman. He wanted to show the American people really what their money had gone toward. And so a First Lady had never given a tour of the White House before. But for Mrs. Kennedy in the age of television, this was the opportunity to put the word out there that she was doing this work, and also really to raise awareness, because then all of a sudden the White House is flooded with people who are saying they have all kinds of, we have examples of this. Oh, we have these types of things. So it's actually a pretty ingenious effort on her part to get the word out about the restoration of the White House, but also to solicit, people for potential donations or gifts.
Absolutely. Patrick, in your book, The Nixon White House Redecoration and Acquisition Program, you have this quote that I really love. You say, "If Jacqueline Kennedy brought lilies to the White House, Patricia Nixon gilded them." Can you talk about what you mean by this and a little bit of a comparison between the Nixons and the Kennedys?
I can build on to what Dr. Costello has said, who said it perfectly. There are many schools of thought about how the White House should be restored, redecorated, or whatever. And I think the Kennedy version and the Nixon version were kind of separate and yet eventually came together. I think that the Kennedy aesthetic was the House has its own history and needs to represent its own things that need to come back if they can. But of course, if you wanted to restore the Grant Red Room, it would be impossible because everything's gone. As far as the Nixons were concerned, their major focus was the White House should reflect the very best of American art and design. And it had and the emphasis was on American. That was very much what Nixon thought and what Mrs. Nixon thought as well. So I think that anytime anything was added during the Nixon redecoration, Mrs. Nixon was very careful to say, I'm just adding to this, what Mrs. Kennedy laid down. She was always very cautious about taking a lot of credit. And she did so much. I'm glad that that this is happening now to acknowledge all that she's done. But she was always reluctant to compare herself with Jacqueline Kennedy. So those two schools of thought, should the White House reflect its own history? Should it be invented as long as we bring in the best? And I think that's a struggle that's still going on today in the White House.
Excellent. Pat Nixon works really closely with the White House curator, Clement Conger. Patrick, where was he working prior to the Nixon presidency, and how do this pair meet?
It's a very interesting story. Mr. Conger, Clement Conger, was a Virginia gentleman. He was an assistant chief of protocol at the State Department. And he worked very closely in the State Department to start a collection of furniture, of federal furniture that the State Department could exhibit. The only problem was that building was a 1960s glass and steel building without kind of a shell to show anything. So working with Edward Vason Jones, he created these colonial interiors with plaster and wood that were incredible. It's the only thing I can say. If you go to visit today, you can still see them. It was a creation of these two. Clement Conger brought in furniture. Edward Mason Jones did all the creation of these wonderful colonial interiors that never existed in colonial America, but it was an attempt to, this is what we could have if you wanted to. It's sort of like a garde meuble that America doesn't have. A garde meuble is a type of organization that collects furniture for historic uses. Most countries have that. We don't have that. So the State Department and the White House are the closest things we have besides museums for that purpose. What he was he was the chief of protocol there. And in the summer of 1969, President Nixon, with kind of a push from H.R. Haldeman, the chief of staff, went to visit the State Department rooms. And he was amazed at what he saw and said, "Oh, goodness, this is wonderful. Why don't you go over to the White House and do this for us?" And that's how it happened. The previous curator was leaving for the Capitol, James Ketchum. He went on to do wonderful things at the Capitol. And so Clement Conger divided his time between the White House in the morning and the State Department in the afternoon. And he brought along with him Edward Mason Jones. And together they worked through all this incredible recreation of the White House into an all-American version, is what I would call it, being very careful to do everything American that they could. And he worked very closely with Mrs. Nixon. He was very good friends with Mrs. Nixon, and they got along very well together. And I think that was a very good working relationship, including with Edward Mason Jones. Not quite like the Kennedy years, where there was a little tension between the decorators and their different visions of the rooms. They worked perfectly together.
Patrick, can you briefly take us a little bit further into that Pat Nixon decoration of the White House? Where does she start and what is her approach?
Okay. I was very lucky, I'm going to segue to something personal here, as a boy of 18 to get a job in Washington, D.C. at the Marriott at Twin Bridges. I don't know if it's still there or not. This is over 60 years ago. But I worked at night, but during the day I could visit all of the monuments in Washington, D.C., and there was no security then. You could just jump in a line and go through. I think I visited the White House at least twice a week. After a while, the guards would kind of look at me like, "What are you doing here again?" And I'd have to look. The Kennedy rooms were still intact at that time. And by intact, I mean the shell was there, but I noticed every chair was worn. There were splits in upholstery. All of the silks on the walls were just buckling and sagging. It looked very, very dingy, even though it was a beautiful shell. And when Mrs. Nixon first arrived, she said, "I don't really want to make any changes," but she saw the need for it, that everything needed refreshing. The Kennedys did not order extra materials, and those materials, a lot of them came from France and were very expensive. So, and added to that were the Johnsons were very encouraging of the public to come in and, "Y'all come, y'all sit down, have a seat." Whereas the Kennedy rooms were more like more attractive to look at than to actually use. That was the purpose. But then in all those years between 1963 and 1969, a lot of wear and tear occurred, as it does every so many years. It's just a lot of work. So when Conger came on board, he was really pushing to remove a lot of the Kennedy touches because he saw that as not American, but more French. Of course, our early presidents always preferred that. Anytime there was a chance to grab French furniture, they would grab it because that's what they preferred. George Washington is famous in 1790 for going to an auction at the French embassy and grabbing everything he could. It was French rather than the Chippendale. And then, of course, Jefferson preferred French and Monroe preferred the French as well. So that part of the White House should be reflected. So they began with the ground floor rooms. I think the Vermeil room was the first. They wanted to get that ready for Tricia Nixon's wedding. And that was a change of color and a different aspect of how the walls should be. The China room followed. The library was another one that came on later. Diplomatic reception room had some changes of furniture. It was essentially the same as Mrs. Kennedy had, but just with rearrangements of furnishings. Upstairs in the main rooms, a lot of repainting, like the East Room and the State Dining Room. The curtains there were relatively new and relatively fresh. But in the Green Room, the Blue Room, and the Red Room, as I've said, and also the entrance hall, it showed a lot of wear. So they really concentrated on those rooms. By 1971, in November, the Red Room was finished. It was more or less as Mrs. Kennedy left it, except the red had changed to a more American rose red. The green room was changed completely with Duncan Fife furniture. Mostly with a kind of a showpiece of Duncan Fife furniture. And the blue room was given kind of a new look as well with wallpaper, which hadn't been on the walls for over 100 years. So a lot of these changes came about through the pushing of Conger to eliminate the French and make it all more American where he could. Also, the entrance hall was given a new look and more fine American look to it. So upstairs was a different story, and I guess we'll talk about that later. But the program continued after Mrs. Nixon left with Mr. Jones and Conger as well.
Excellent. Switching gears a little bit, we've talked a lot about the interior, but I did want to go back to Bob over here and talk a little bit more about the exterior. You've mentioned it a little bit in the beginning, but what does Pat Nixon do to sort of enhance the exterior of the White House?
Sure, she did one of the most amazing things that is kind of surprising it hadn't been done before. But shortly after she became First Lady, she started to receive some letters from people who had visited Washington and had seen the monuments at night. You know, the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, and the Jefferson Memorial, all lit up beautifully. The White House was dark, no exterior lighting on the White House. So she decided that she would make that a project straight away. And there was money left over from the money that had been raised privately for the inaugural festivities, the balls and all the rest. And she decided, let's use that money to light the White House at night. So she worked with engineers with the National Park Service, who's responsible for the grounds of the White House. And they devised a lighting scheme. And she wanted to kind of make it a surprise for the president. So one night they were coming back on the presidential helicopter, I think from Camp David or maybe from Andrews Air Force Base. And as they approached the White House, it was dark. All of a sudden, the lights went on and it was illuminated for the first time ever. The president was so thrilled by this that he had the helicopter circle the White House, not just once, not just twice, but 3 times, which was not on the flight plan, I'm sure. But you know, when the president says, let's circle the White House, the pilot says, yes, sir, and they circle the White House. But so the lighting of the White House is, you know, now when we think of it now, we assume that it had always been lit. But in fact, it was not lit until 1970, thanks to Pat Nixon. The other thing that was really important is that, you know, under the flag code, when it gets dark, you take the flag down. Well, the flag over the White House by presidential proclamation, once it was lit, now flies 24/7 over the White House. That's been true ever since 1970, when Mrs. Nixon pushed the button in a little ceremony they had on the South Lawn, pushed a button to light up the White House for the first time, except for the time that it was lit when the President and Mrs. Nixon circled it. The Marine Band was there playing America the Beautiful, and the house suddenly became lit. It must have seemed almost like that scene in The Wizard of Oz when Dorothy lands, you know, in Oz, and it's all in sepia color because of, you know, it was, you know, from that farmhouse in Kansas, which I'm sure never looked as bad as it did in that picture. And then she opens the door, and there's the beautiful Munchkin land, you know, all in vivid Technicolor. And I think that must have been kind of the same effect that people had who had been used to seeing the White House dark at night, only the lights in the rooms and the windows illuminating it. All of a sudden, in all its glory, lit at night, and the American flag flying proudly over the house 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all year. So that was, you know, the exterior of the White House. Philip mentioned a few things that happened, a few minor things, but the White House has pretty much looked like the White House, with the exception of when President Truman added the balcony on the south portico. But if you look at pictures of the White House from, you know, way back when they first started taking pictures, you go, yeah, that's the White House. But now it can be seen now it can be seen at night, and it really is just a magnificent sight. If you ever get to Washington, be sure to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue and look at how beautiful that house looks at night. And then, you know, give a nice thought for Pat Nixon, who thought to do that and accomplished it.
So when it comes to the collection itself, one fun fact that I always like to tell people is that Mrs. Nixon acquires a lot of artwork for the White House collection. More, in fact, than some other First Ladies, like Jacqueline Kennedy. This is kind of unexpected. Most people are a little bit surprised by this. I was wondering, Bob and Patrick, and really anyone that wants to hop in on this, can you talk a little bit about Mrs. Nixon's overall impact on the White House collection and maybe highlight some of the pieces that she adds?
Sure, I'll start, if that's okay with Patrick. Mrs. Nixon acquired more than 600 pieces for the White House collection, antiques, of furniture and decorative arts, paintings, and everything else. That's more than any First Lady before or since. And the things that she acquired were really top-notch, first-quality, museum-worthy pieces. Back in 2011, when we were getting ready to open an exhibit in 2012 to commemorate what would have been Mrs. Nixon's 100th birthday, a couple of us went to the White House and met with the curator at the time, Bill Ullman. And I remember we were standing in the cross hall, and I asked Mr. Ullman, I said, we'd love to borrow for our exhibit a couple of pieces that Mrs. Nixon acquired for the White House collection. And I said, I'm sure there are some things in the warehouse that, you wouldn't mind sending out to California for a few months. And he stopped me short. He said, no. Everything that Mrs. Nixon acquired is of such quality, none of it's in the warehouse, it's all here in the house. But he very generously lent to us for that exhibit back in 2012 a Duncan Fife chair from the green room and a landscape by the American artist George Innes that was called, let me get this name exactly right, The Rainbow in the Berkshire Hills. It was painted in 1869, and we were able to display them here the first time ever that White House furniture was displayed here on the West Coast, and it was one of the jewels in the crown in that exhibit. But again, more than 600 pieces, more than any First Lady for or since, and she was very persuasive in getting people to give things. Often she'd say, could you loan us something? And then after a while, she would say, well, maybe you give it to us because it works so well here in the house. So she did a great job persuading people to part with things that have been in their family forever, including the Adams family, two portraits that have been that's Adams with one D, two portraits of President and Mrs. Adams that have been in the family for more than 200 years. They gave those to the White House. There's some great pictures of her with all of the descendants of President and Mrs. Adams in the room, giving these two portraits that had hung in the Adams house up in Massachusetts for 200 years. Yeah, she was very persuasive.
Excellent. Patrick, anything to add on that?
I think that the Nixon White House depended on a new aesthetic for interiors, for period interiors, kind of espoused by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1970. Barry Tracy, a former Iowan, was kind of the spearheading of that. It was a kind of a presentation of making the rooms as pristine and perfect as possible. And Mrs. Nixon, of course, was really on board for that. Things that were not available in the 1960s for the Kennedys became available in the 1970s, and a whole new aesthetic of looking at these period rooms and making them not only pretty to look at, but also functioning and being able to be to stand the test of time. And I think that should be something that we're very grateful to her. Her eye and the eye of Mason Jones and Conger still exists, really. The green room, the blue room, and the red room have the same curtain designs, although hues have changed a bit, as the Nixon. If she came to the house today, she would recognize those rooms, I think, very much as they were left.
Derek, what? Real quick. William Seal, a great historian of the White House, who wrote this fantastic 2-volume history of the White House. I read it over one summer, and it's really thick. I mean, it would be, enough for 2 doorstops if you wanted to use it that way.
For sure.
It's really good. But he wrote, the Nixon era was the greatest single period of collecting in White House history. The great collection of White House Americana today is the long shadow of Mrs. Nixon. The impulse, the idea, and the energy were hers. And for a historian like William Seal to say that, I think we can really say, yes, that's exactly right.
Well, and I think I would just add that the earlier panel today talked about sort of the connections between Mrs. Kennedy, Mrs. Johnson, Mrs. Nixon, and I've long thought that those 3 women, when we're talking about the creation of the White House collection, the institutionalization of the curator's office, Committee for the Preservation of the White House, And then really, having that teed up for Pat Nixon to really pursue these things, it was really these three successive first ladies that really, I think, put the pieces in place, institutionalized it, and then carried it out. Because now there is this expectation with every first lady that has come in, what are you doing for the White House? Not just in addition to your initiatives or to your projects, but what work are you having done in the House? And that has become an extension of that those three first ladies contributed to.
Excellent. So now that we've talked about the White House, its renovations, structural changes, and all these restorations and the collection, I want to return to this idea of the White House as the people's house. And we talked about it a little bit earlier, but one of the things that I find really interesting with these big renovations and restorations is that desire to show off the house. So Matt talked in the beginning about that 1962 Jacqueline Kennedy tour. And as he mentioned, there have been some others as well. And what I think is really interesting that all of the people that we're talking about today basically do a televised tour. I was wondering, Robert, if you could talk a little bit more about that Harry Truman 1952 tour. What was sort of the public reaction to it? And I believe Harry Truman does also show off his piano skills in that particular interview. Little fun fact.
Yes. Well, I want to preface what I'm going to say with maybe a antithesis and say that as the White House began to crumble, and literally the cracks appeared and the plaster fell down and the chandeliers were lowered, Harry Truman, who was conscious enough that this was the people's house, the first thing he did was close the house to visitors, because he understood that it would have a very negative effect, not only in the perception of the house, but the perception of him. He was getting ready for the 1948 campaign. There had been a lot of terrible jokes about poor President Truman, including "I'm just mild about Harry." And the idea was that, oh, here was a bumpkin from Missouri, and he doesn't know how to live in a mansion, and look, he's wrecked the place. And so, conscious of, obviously, his image, but also the White House's image, as the place began to encounter serious troubles, he shuttered it. So the television tour, I think that was like a victory lap for Truman, because he wanted to show that the millions of taxpayer dollars that had been set aside for this work was money well spent. And that was really the whole idea of it. I also think it's too bad that he didn't run for office again, although I'm sure Beth would disagree with that, because he showed himself to be a natural in front of the TV cameras, and he was very funny with Walter Cronkite, who was, then just perhaps not as well known as he would become later. They started out downstairs in the diplomatic reception room, and Truman quipped to Cronkite that the portraits of the presidents that had hung around the room were taken down and replaced with portraits of first ladies. And he said, and now this is 1952, he said, "I think the room looks much better with pretty ladies in it." So, goodness gracious. So anyway, he conducted this tour, and in 1952, remember, you had commercial television coming out around 1947, 48, and it was adopted very quickly. So by 1952, 1/3 of the houses in the United States had a television set. So this was a major media event. And it was, like I said, good for him politically. I think he was very conscious of his legacy. And the reason I say that is, as you can imagine, with something as big as the White House renovation, it ran behind and it ran over budgets. And Truman, he applied what he called his curry comb to the architects and engineers and his own commission on renovation to hurry it up, to keep it going, because he wanted to get in the house and live there for nearly a year, because he saw this renovation as his legacy, and so, or at least part of his legacy. And so when the television tour happened, it was like him claiming a ribbon that he thought that he deserved, and in fact, I think he did.
I wanted to ask you more about your experience of seeing that Jacqueline Kennedy tour on television. What was that like as a member of the American public?
As I said, I was 11 years old. I knew nothing about decor or anything like that, even though I was a little fag boy. I didn't know that at the time. But I was fascinated with how she went without notes through all these rooms, and she talked about the various pieces of furniture, the paintings, the rugs, everything. We were very delighted to hear that a lady from Des Moines, Iowa, Mrs. Louise Noun, was mentioned for giving a desk. Later, that desk was found out to be a copy, big embarrassment, but that caught my attention right away. And I was so impressed with all that she knew about that. And later, when I went to school in France, I was well prepared from my reading about the White House and Bélanger and all the French furniture makers to really appreciate what I saw in France. And then as soon as I came back from France, I went to Washington, D.C. and saw these beautiful rooms. As I said, they were rather shabby in bits and pieces, but still beautiful to see.
Excellent. I want to do just the briefest pivot. When we were talking for this call, Patrick mentioned that the Nixons actually make some changes to not just the White House, but to Camp David as well. So briefly, I was hoping you could set the scene, Matt, and talk a little bit about the formation of Camp David.
Sure. So the site today known as Camp David dates back to the 1930s. It was originally designed to be a campsite, and it was created in part with the Works Progress Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps. And this became one of the proposed sites for FDR's getaways. Now, bear in mind that this is the late 1930s, early 1940s. Concerns over presidential security have increased, in particular after the United States enters World War II. And so there's concern about the president, who oftentimes actually much preferred taking the presidential yacht. He preferred either going on a river cruise or going off the coast. There's concern with German U-boats that the president of the United States could be a target. And so the proposed solution is to find a place not too far from Washington, D.C., where the president of the United States can get away. And one of these proposed sites is in Maryland, just outside of Thurmont. And so FDR is the first one to use, of course, he names it Shangri-La, which is from a novel, and that's a very FDR thing to do, I would say, giving it that particular name. And the name doesn't stick around very long. Harry Truman will use Camp David somewhat, not quite as much as Franklin Roosevelt. Eisenhower, of course, is the one who gives it the very famous name Camp David, named after his grandson. The Eisenhowers also, use Camp David a fair amount. They enjoy the outdoors. It's another place for Mrs. Eisenhower to redecorate, and she does in true Mamie fashion. But the other thing to keep in mind, by the time we're getting into the 1960s and the 1970s, is that this is more a presidential retreat, and there's still a lot of work that needs to be done at the White House. So if we were thinking that, there's going to be a major renovation of Camp David, that's not really the case. They're really sort of getting by with either what they find in government storage, what can be procured fairly inexpensively, and sometimes it's even sort of going into government storage or things that the United States Navy still has and using that for outfitting some of the cabins. In fact, the cabins don't even get heat until Harry Truman. So that goes to show you just how rustic this place was. I mean, it really was like summer camp. Think of it like a summer camp. And so I think with that, I'll turn it over to Patrick to fill us in a little bit more about Camp David during the Nixons.
Okay, very good. Yes. When the Nixons took office, H.R. Haldeman, who was the chief of staff at the time, thought Camp David needed a refreshing because, as you said, it was rather shabby and very rustic. And so he ordered redecoration for the whole thing, mostly pulled from government storage or General Services Administration. Mrs. Nixon was rather upset with that because she wasn't consulted. She didn't like any of the choices, so she had it all removed. And there she could really show herself. I've never seen pictures of her interiors there, so I can't judge, but I'm sure she brought her own beautiful warmth to that and her own decorating style, not relying on a decorator, but her own style. President Nixon wanted a pool there because remember the pool in the White House is now covered over. So he said, I want it right there. And he pointed to a spot, and unfortunately, that was where Camp David's bomb shelter was located. So, okay, the president wants it there. The bomb shelter was removed. The new peanut-shaped pool was installed. A lot of money was spent there, but it's served the presidents since then quite well, I think. There's been major decorations since, but Mrs. Nixon really did the main job of making it beautiful and very comfortable. And the Nixons did use it quite a bit.
All right, so I want to turn to the idea of legacy overall. A trend that I've noticed in recent years is that we've seen fewer overall total overhauls of the spaces in the White House. There's been a lot more specific replacements and updates or of specific room or space that has been focused on. So I'm curious for the group here, what do you think will be the future of White House restoration projects? Will we continue to follow this more modern trend, or do you think we will see more large-scale situations? Anyone can answer.
Go ahead.
I think because the White House is right now in such a, it's a world-class museum really of American furniture and decorative arts. As Patrick mentioned earlier, kind of the design scheme that came in during the Nixon years has pretty much remained. If you look at photographs of the green room and the red room and the blue room from the Nixon years, and then in subsequent presidencies, they really do look very familiar. So the overall design scheme has stayed the same. Every once in a while, I'm sure there'll be at some future date, some president who will think, this place isn't big enough. We're all crammed in here. We've got too much staff. We need more space. There may be efforts to do that sort of thing. But I think the White House itself, the mansion, I can't imagine any more major sort of restorations. And with all those steel beams that Harry Truman put in, we don't have to worry about it collapsing anytime soon. So I think it's kind of pretty much remained much the same.
Oh, it's my turn. I am the least qualified to answer this question, so I will bring up a tangential point. During the renovation of the White House, Lorenzo Winslow, the White House architect, was very careful to have all of the interiors removed. And so if you look around here, you see the fluted pilasters and the cornice and the other bits of carving. All of that was taken out and put into storage. And the idea was that when the time came and the shell of the house was finished, that all of that would be put back in. Well, they had two problems with that. One, it all didn't fit back in because some of the walls had moved and, they had ductwork and other things to allow for. Their other problem was Harry Truman, because he was pushing this completion date. And as a consequence, a lot of these historic finishings, and when I say historic, we're talking probably dating back to 1902 to Teddy Roosevelt's work, but historic nonetheless. They're historically significant because they were there under several administrations. Much of that was classified as government surplus, and it wound up all over the place. Lorton Prison in Virginia got some of it. And some of it, unfortunately, was either chopped up for the official souvenir program, which is a whole separate thing, and some of it wound up in a landfill across the Potomac. And so why am I telling you this tedious story? Because I remember reading the minutes of the Commission on Renovation, and some of those gentlemen lamented that to try to save time, they were discarding important things. And instead of carving like a festoon, for example, they did something called compo, which was sawdust and glue stamped with the right impression and then just painted. And it says in the minutes, if you paint it over, nobody's going to know, right? Well, I can't prove this, but my idea is I think that lament found its manifestation in a greater reverence for the house and its historical fabric going forward. So whatever they choose to do, and I agree with my colleagues, I don't think it's going to be anywhere near as ambitious as gutting the house, not least because it doesn't have to be. But I think that the level of preservation and the reverence for design and the importance of history as incorporated in renovation work, I think that is partly a legacy of some of the mistakes made during the Truman renovation.
I think what I would add to this is that it has become fairly typical to see every administration have some type of larger project and maybe the assortment of smaller projects in the House. That has become fairly common. I don't think we'll see anything like Pat Nixon's program again in terms of the scope, in terms of the number of rooms. I mean, I think that was a very unique moment in time, and her pairing with Clem Conger was a big part of that, why all that was able to be done. And also I think this is a reciprocal effect of first ladies are also now expected to really be representatives of the administration to a degree, and to have their own initiatives outside of the White House. And so while they're still sort of seen as these caretakers and guardians of the historic house, there's also a societal expectation placed on them to be out there advocating for a particular issue. And it's fascinating because, as it was pointed out earlier, it's an unpaid position, but man, do they have a really big portfolio these days.
Patrick, did you have anything to add?
Yes. It's hard to get news about the White House except from my friends, because in Portugal we're kind of cut off. Much to my regret, I no longer get the White House history because I'm too far away. But I was very intrigued by the new campaign, well, a few years back, of the new upholstery, the more correct upholstery in the Blue Room. That really delighted me. Even though they had to go with Prel, a foreign manufacturer, it still points to a good idea about the future. I agree with my colleagues. I don't think there's going to be a major scaled improvement or changes or wholesale renovations again. It might be piecemeal, like in the Blue Room, bringing in the pieces as those pieces of Belanger furniture back in and incorporating them and removing any copies. Robert, I've always been intrigued by the plan of Winslow. I think it was 45 or 46, to create an extension to the West Wing with a wonderful auditorium. And I wonder, it's too bad that wasn't done. I think it would still be useful today, modernized, but I wonder if something like that might happen someday.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and I feel like through my own studies for the Hidden White House, there was a palpable difference in the reverence for the mansion proper, the 1800 house, and the two wings, which have become important in their own right, but they are perhaps a step or two down in the reverence with which they're regarded. And as we know, space is a chronic problem because our government doesn't contract, although perhaps Mr. Musk will, see to that. But everything has been moved over to the executive office building, right? The overflow. And it's kind of strange because to have to cross the street to do White House business, it just seems rather incongruous, right? And I've seen the plans that you've talked about, and it's funny because a lot of people dismiss them as atrocious. I agree with you. I think that they're actually very nice. Yes. And there certainly is room for it. You can take a little bit of the South Lawn. It's okay. It's possible. It's possible. I think that having more of the functioning of the White House in the House proper is a logical idea. So perhaps that'll happen.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank everyone for joining me today, but I have one final anecdote that I thought I would bring up because it's a nice little Nixon-Kennedy connection. So, Bob, in 1971, the Nixons hung the recently completed Kennedy White House portraits that were painted by the artist Aaron Schickler. And there's a particularly touching story of Mrs. Kennedy's one and only return to the White House following the death of her husband to view these portraits, and they are coming at the invitation of the Nixons. Can you tell us more about this return visit?
Yeah, this story, I think, talks about just how people who have lived in the White House feel a connection to other people who've lived in the White House, regardless of what their politics were. But when the official portraits of the President and Mrs. Kennedy were ready to be installed in the White House, Mrs. Nixon contacted Mrs. Onassis at that time. She had remarried to Aristotle Onassis, and invited her if she wanted to come for a small ceremony at the White House for the official unveiling of these portraits. And Mrs. Kennedy replied that she just could not. She did not want to return and have a press event and have her children there exposed to the press. She had worked so hard since leaving the White House to keep her children away from the prying eyes of the press and the paparazzi and all the rest. But she suggested, maybe at some point, we might just kind of drop in unannounced and look at them. So Mrs. Nixon rather, picked up on that and arranged for a private visit for Mrs. Onassis and Caroline and John, who were young, very young at the time. And I think John was probably 11 and Caroline was 14 or 15, to come to the White House. So the president sent a military jet up to New York for the Kennedy family to come down, the three of them, to see the portraits and also tour the White House and have dinner together. And nobody in the White House, there were 4 people who knew that this was going to happen because they wanted to really preserve Mrs. Onassis' privacy and the privacy of her children. No photographs were taken of this extraordinary visit. But it was really something because, as you know, we all recall that in 1960, the race between Nixon and Kennedy was very, very tight. President Kennedy won by a very narrow margin. And for the family of the defeated candidate in 1960 to extend this courtesy to Mrs. Onassis and her children was quite extraordinary. Mrs. Kennedy wrote an amazing note back to Mrs. Nixon after the tour. And in her note, she wrote, and I'll quote this exactly, "I have never seen the White House look so beautiful. There is no hidden corner of it that is not beautiful now. It was moving when we left to see that great house illuminated with the fountains playing. Thank you with all my heart. A day I always dreaded turned out to be one of the most precious ones I have spent with my children." An extraordinary visit. And back when we did the Pat Nixon Centennial exhibit, we asked Caroline Kennedy if she would tape a little video recalling that visit. And so she agreed. We were kind of surprised, but you know, you always have to ask. The worst that happens is somebody says no. And she agreed to do it. So we had a video crew go up to New York. I went up for this taping, and Caroline did it in one take. It was great. And the closing of her remarks on this video, I think, are a really appropriate way to close this discussion. She said on that video, which is also available on the Nixon Foundation website, "I think my mother really appreciated Mrs. Nixon's thoughtfulness in the sense that there are family values and a dedication to politics and patriotism that go beyond any disagreement on issues or party. So I think one of the things you learn having lived in the White House is that there really are these common experiences, and what we share is so much larger than what divides us." And I think that sentiment is, you know, evergreen, something that we probably ought to think of a little bit about today, and maybe a good way to wrap things up.
All right, well, that was the perfect wrap-up, Bob. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today. They have been absolutely fantastic. A round of applause for them.